Hello there and welcome to this video on servicing and rebuilding a humour regulator. In this video we're going to be concentrating on the regulator found in the Daystate Wolverine, and as you can see here I've already removed the regulator from the rifle. If you need a disassembly guide for the Daystate Wolverine, on the Daystate YouTube channel there is a full video disassembly, and if you go over to the Daystate website there is a full Haynes manual for the rifle as well. With that said, the other thing that I want to mention is that a full rebuild kit for these regulators is available on the Humour website. The kit includes all of the O-rings, a little bit of silicone grease, as well as the small white sealing disc found in the middle of the regulator. With that said, I have two regulators in front of me. This one is out of the high power rifle and this one is out of a sub 12 pound rifle. The regulators themselves are pretty much identical, the only difference is the Belleville stack. The Belleville stack in this regulator is slightly stiffer to allow the regulator to achieve a higher set pressure. With that all out the way, we can begin. The first thing we're going to be doing is taking a measurement of the current set position of the adjuster screw. To do this we're going to take a measurement from the top of the body to the top of the adjuster screw, and we're going to do that using a set of calipers. So on this particular reg it's about 1.2 millimeters, and on the high power regulator this is about 2.1 millimeters. So I'll make a note of that, as when we come to rebuild the regulators we want the regulator set pressure to be roughly the same. With that said, we can begin. What I'm going to be doing is putting the high pressure regulator off to one side. As the regulators are pretty much identical, we'll only be disassembling one for the video. I will however show you the differences in the Belleville washers when we get to that stage. The first thing we're going to be doing is taking a 22mm spanner, putting the regulator in the spanner like so, then coming through with some grips and just removing this end cap. This end cap shouldn't be done up super tight from the factory, but it probably will be done up a little tighter than hand tight. With that done, the next thing we can do is use an M5 bolt just to pull the piston out from the back of the regulator. Nice and carefully like so, and on this particular regulator the white sealing disc came out as well. The last thing we have in the body itself is the adjuster screw, and we're going to be removing that using a flat bladed screwdriver. And there we have it, that's pretty much it, that's the regulator fully disassembled. So what we'll do now is get everything set up and then I'll explain what each of the O-rings do. With the regulator disassembled, we'll run through the function of each of the O-rings. So starting off with the reg body houses three O-rings. The top one, this one here, stops bottle pressure from entering the regulator pressure chamber. If this one has failed, air will be able to travel from the bottle into the reg chamber, so the regulator pressure will eventually equal bottle pressure. The next one, this one down here, seals the joint between the regulator and the body of the rifle. So if this one has failed, you'll have a small leak emanating from the joint of the two components. And finally for the regulator body we have this one at the end. This one seals the joint between the regulator body and the end cap, and if this one has failed, you'll have a leak emanating between the joint of these two components. With that said, we can now move on to the regulator piston and the adjuster screw. And starting off with the regulator adjuster screw, this has one O-ring on the end of it, and this O-ring stops the bottle pressure from entering the regulator pressure chamber. Like with the body O-ring, this one here, if this O-ring has failed, bottle pressure will be able to get into the regulated pressure chamber, and the regulator pressure will eventually equal bottle pressure. And then finally we have the regulator piston. The regulator piston has two O-rings on it, one at the top, one at the bottom, and these two O-rings seal off the Belleville chamber. So the Belleville chamber should never be pressurized, and the Belleville chamber itself will always be at atmospheric pressure. If we take a look at the body, we see this little bleed screw here, or bleed hole I should say, in the side of the regulator body. If either of these two O-rings have failed, you will get a small consistent leak out of this hole here. And finally we have the white sealing disc, this part here. If this has failed or needs replacing, you'll see a substantial amount of regulator creep. Regulator creep is regulator adjustment after the rifle has reached its set pressure. So for example, if your regulator was set to 120 bar and you left the rifle 5 minutes, if the regulator has crept up to 130 bar, you would need to replace this. And when servicing a regulator, it is always best to either replace the disc entirely or flip it over to the good side. Both sides of the disc are usable, so the first time you service the rifle from the factory, you can just flip the disc over instead of replacing it entirely. With that said, the last thing I'll do before we take the O-rings off is just show you the difference between the Belleville washers. So this one here is the FAC regulators, and this one here is the sub 12 pound regulator. As you can see there, the FAC Belleville washers are considerably thicker than the sub 12 pound rifle, so that's just the difference between the washers. As you can see on this particular rifle, the stack is identical, so we have 6 Bellevilles cupped in pairs in alternating sets, with the only real difference being the thickness of the Bellevilles. With that said, the next thing we'll do is take all the O-rings off, give the regulator a clean, then put it all back together. Now we'll say that you technically don't have to replace the O-rings every time you service the regulator. Most of them will be reusable. However, the O-rings are so cheap it's just worth replacing the entire set. So to remove the O-rings, what I like to use is a plastic O-ring pick. And as long as the O-rings haven't turned too hard, what you can do is pinch the side of the O-rings, give it a little squeeze, then push it over to one side. What this will do is hump the O-ring up and allow you to get your pick under the O-ring and force it off. So there we have it there. Do the same on all of the other O-rings. Pinch it, hump it up, and then lift it off. Depending on how long the O-rings have been there, some of the O-rings can turn very hard. They can also get stuck in the seat. So if you have an O-ring that's stuck in its seat, what you can try is just to twist the O-ring inside the seat. That frees it up a little and allows you to hump it up and then pick it off. Now that will allow you to get rid of most of the O-rings on the regulator, although if the regulator has not been serviced in quite some time, the O-rings can sometimes turn very, very hard, almost like plastic seals. When they get like this, no amount of squeezing will actually move the O-ring from the seat, and what you need to do is either use a razor blade to very, very, very carefully cut the O-ring and then hook it out, or using a metal pick, sometimes you can pierce the O-ring and actually just pull it off. Normally what happens is that the O-rings get hard and brittle, so they end up cracking in the seat, and you can normally just pick the parts out of the O-ring seat. But I will emphasize yet again that if you end up using a razor blade or a scalpel blade to remove the O-ring, just be incredibly careful that you don't damage any of the sealing surfaces. What I normally recommend is cutting through about 80% of the O-ring. That leaves a slot in which you can get either a metal O-ring pick or your plastic one in there and sort of break one side of the O-ring off and remove it from the seat. But again, on this particular regulator, the O-rings seem to be coming off fairly easily. To remove the Belleville washers from the piston, you do have to take this piston O-ring off, but once that's off we can remove the Belleville washers. Now it's normally advisable to keep the Belleville washers in the same stack, and you can stack them up on something like an old screw or something like that. Put them on there, keep them nice and safe so they don't get lost or muddled up. But on this one we have 6 Belleville washers cupped in pairs in alternating sets. On this particular regulator pressure, all of the Belleville washers are the same thickness, although for certain regulators that's not always going to be the case. With all of the old O-rings off, what I'm going to do is thoroughly degrease the regulator just with some isopropyl alcohol and some cotton buds and a toothbrush. Get all the old oil and grease out, then we'll put it back together. Whilst we're cleaning up the components, what we want to look out for is any damage to the sealing areas or any damage within the regulator itself. All of the faces in these regulators should be fully machined, and there should be no deep scratches or anything like that in any of the O-ring grooves, any of the faces, anything like that. Pay close attention to the end of the adjuster screw, as this forms a fairly critical seal on the white sealing disc, this piece here. If this seal has a scratch or something like that on it, it may not form an effective seal on the white disc, and that may lead to things like regulator creep. Most of the time though, as long as no debris gets inside the regulator, all the faces should be pretty much brand new. The regulator is designed in a way so that we have replaceable sealing surfaces, so no matter what happens, the metal parts should stay really quite nice for a long time. With that said, I'll get everything cleaned up, then I'll bring you back when we're putting it all together. With that done, I've given all the components a good clean up, so we should be good to go. All the old grease has been taken out and we're ready to put some new stuff in. I've also gone ahead and laid out all of the O-rings so you can see where each of them go. Two things that I'll mention. These two, so the one that go on the adjuster screw and the one that goes on the top of the piston here, are the same. And these two are slightly different. This one is slightly larger than this one, so just be aware of that. It is quite easy to get things mixed up if you take all the O-rings off at once, then go to put them back on. So with that said, we'll start putting the O-rings back on, and the first thing we need to do is just add a small amount of silicone grease to each of the O-rings, and then put them into their respective seats. The O-rings are a lot easier to put on than they are to take off, so this part is quite easy. Next up is the piston. You don't need tons of silicone grease on these components. What I'm doing is just wiping a small amount on, then wiping most of it off. What we can do then is just get the O-ring hooked over into the seat, being nice and careful not to damage the O-ring as we put it on. It is a little fiddly to do with greasy fingers, but as long as you're nice and patient, it shouldn't be that much of an issue. We're not going to be putting this one on just yet, as we do need to restack the Belleville's, but I am getting it greased up while I have greasy fingers. The next step is to restack the Belleville washers onto the regulator piston. Now Huma recommend a small amount of silicone oil or grease over the Bellevilles, so I'm just going to be putting a small layer on just over each of the washers individually. And again, it may look like I'm putting an awful lot on, but what I'm effectively doing is wiping a coat of grease over the Bellevilles, then wiping it off again with my fingers. What we can do then is restack the Bellevilles onto the piston. So the Bellevilles go on cupped in pairs, with the first set being cupped away from the bottom of the piston. On the screen now I'll give a complete list of all the different Belleville stacks for the various different regulator pressure settings. With those stacked, the next thing I'm going to do is just add a very small amount of silicone grease to the top of the piston. What that will do is just hold the white sealing disc in place whilst we assemble the unit. Before I do that though, almost forgot this last O-ring. So this just goes on over the piston shaft and then into the seat there. On this particular regulator I have flipped the white sealing disc, so on this side I'm not quite sure if the camera will pick it up or not, but there is a small dimple in this side of the white puck. What we're going to do is flip it over to a fresh side. So this side is clean, it has not been used before, so we're going to be using that side. With that done, I'm going to just wipe a tiny bit more silicone grease around the external O-rings, just to aid in the installation process. And then using a cotton bud, I am just going to wipe inside the regulator body with just a tad of silicone grease. Again, we don't want tons in here, but we did just fully degrease this unit, so the inside of this piece will be dry. What we want is for the O-rings to slide against the metal nice and freely as we install everything, so nothing gets pinched or nicked as we install the new components. So not tons, just a really, really small layer. With that done, we can put the piston in. The piston goes in from the bottom, nice and carefully. And as we put it in, we're just looking at the white sealing disc and making sure we've got that lined up, then pushing everything gently into place. With that done, we can add the adjuster screw, and again, just a small amount of silicone grease around the external O-ring. Then we can put that in. For now, we're just going to do this up flush. And then we can add this rear cap. So the rear cap just screws on the back there. Getting it done up tight enough by hand, then coming back with our 22mm spanner and our set of grips and just tightening it. This doesn't need to be gorilla tight, it just needs to be nipped up. The next thing we can do is reset the regulator pressure by adjusting our adjuster screw using a flat bladed screwdriver. So R1 was set to 1.2mm from the factory. So we're about 1.7 there. 1.07 I should say. And we've lined the dimple up, this one here, with the 100 bar mark, so we should be roughly where we started. And there we have it. But there we have it, there's the regulator fully rebuilt. So what we're going to do now is bring over my tester and we'll test the regulator just to make sure everything is working exactly as it should. So the tester itself has the correct fitting for the regulator, a digital regulator gauge, and then a bleed screw on this side. So we'll reset that, hook up our scuba tank, making sure that the bleed screw is tightened down. Then we can add our regulator. Again, tiny bit more silicone grease around the O-rings, getting that put into position. And now we can pressurize the unit. As you can see there, we've got about 95 bar on the gauge. It will take a little bit of time for the gauge to settle, and the regulator itself will need a few dry fires to cycle properly. So there we have it, the regulator is settling around the 98 bar mark. I will say that this setup is particularly bad for regulator creep. What we have here is an absolutely microscopic plenum, and any small change in air temperature will show up on the gauge. Normally what happens with these testers is you mess around for a little bit, the air temperature stabilizes in the unit, and then everything slows down on the gauge. Obviously as well, this is a brand new regulator with all new O-rings, so it will take some bedding in. Generally speaking, as long as the regulator is working as it should at this stage, I normally give them between sort of 200-250 pellets just to bed them in. So a little bit of creep isn't worrying me at the minute. And obviously you're probably not going to have a reg tester, so you're going to need to do your testing on the rifle. The Wolverine does have a reg gauge on the side, so you can compare what the regulator is set to now versus what it was before you took it apart. But I'm quite happy with how the regulator is operating, so what we'll do now is I'll take the regulator out again and we'll show you how to adjust the reg set pressure. Right then, so with the regulator out the tester, we can have a look at the gauge markings. Let's say we want to decrease reg pressure. At the moment we're around the 100 bar mark according to the sticker, but we want to take it down to say 90. All we need to do is, using a flat bladed screwdriver, adjust the adjuster screw down to 90. So there we have it. There's adjusting the regulator down. To increase the reg pressure, it's a little more complex. So let's say we want to go to 110. What we need to do is go up and above the actual set pressure. So the actual marking isn't marked on this one, but say that's 120. We then come back down to 110, and that removes any backlash within the screw itself. In other words, what you're trying to do is always adjust down to your reg pressure. You don't want to wind out to get it. With that said, let's reinstall the regulator and see what it says on the gauge. So the regulator is settling around the 107 bar mark. Around 106 after a couple dry fires. So we didn't hit exactly 110 bar on the reg set pressure, but if we really wanted to, we could go through the same process again, taking the regulator out, readjusting the adjuster screw, and then fine-tuning until we get our desired reg pressure. I will say that depending on your rifle configuration, there will be a different reg set pressure for each of the different calibers and power levels. However, Daystate have released a full list of all the rifles and their respective reg set pressures, so what you can do is look up your particular rifle and check what the recommended reg set pressure is. With that said, the adjustment procedure for the FAC regulators is exactly the same. The actual sticker on the end there does have a number of different markings. As you can see here, this one goes up to 170, whereas this one only went up to 110. But there we have it. That's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and we'll see you in the next one.